Well, welcome to the Storied Outdoors. My name is Brad Hill, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Brian Gill, and we are very excited today to be joined by Andrew Peterson, singer-songwriter and author. Our family and Brian's family, I know, have both enjoyed the Wingfeather Saga, and both Brian and I have read and enjoyed Adorning the Dark, and recently really enjoyed your newest book, which we look forward to getting to talk about. But one thing that's also impacted us is in 2008, driven by a desire to cultivate a strong Christian arts community, you founded a ministry called the Rabbit Room, which led to a yearly conference that we've both enjoyed, countless concerts, symposiums, the Rabbit Room Press, which has published a whole bunch of books. It's incredible. Been married for 24 years to your wife, Jamie. Then you have 3 children. Your eldest is an animation student at Lipscomb University. Your second son, a touring drummer, record producer, and your daughter just recently released her first album. Man, that's incredible. And I love that in your spare time, you mentioned that you sleep. We appreciate nothing like some good rest. But it keep bees, and you build stone stacked walls and gardens, and you draw a good bit. You're a Renaissance man, brother. But we're so thankful that you've joined us today on the Storied Outdoors.
Glad to be with you guys. It's funny that the bio that I guess my people would have sent you is 2 years out of date. So it's now 26 years I've been married, and
Nice.
my oldest son is a graduate and got married last summer. My second son is still producing records and drumming and got married also last summer. And my daughter just started at university. So yeah, in
Wow.
those short 2 years, we've had some huge life changes,
That's awesome.
which is pretty awesome. So that's part of the reason we're out of the country right now. Is this is our empty nester celebration. We're just kind of made it out of the woods, and we're out here hanging out. So
Man, that's awesome. A lot can happen in 2 years.
No
yes,
kidding.
it's amazing, kind of amazing.
Man, speaking of
Yeah.
2 years, we in
So
2019 we were at Horseshoe together. Brad and I were, and that was man, what a fun experience there in Nashville, and actually that was kind of the birthplace of our idea to do something creative together, Brad and myself. And so from that, we went on a fishing trip with that later
awesome.
that next year, and then it's just it kind of snowballed into what it is now. And we're in season 3 now here with the Storied Outdoors podcast. So
That's awesome. That's awesome. So 2019, who was the keynote speaker that year? Do you remember? Would that have
Carolyn,
been that was Carolyn Aaron.
yeah,
Carol,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, she's so great.
man,
I guess that means that was the last in-person Hutchmoot.
it
That's
was.
right. That's
I'm
right.
still sitting on my
Absolutely.
tickets for 2020.
Okay, good. They're still good for next year,
Me
man.
too.
Hold on to those.
Yeah. I'm holding on to him, man, like a golden ticket, man, just waiting to go see what's in store. Yeah, I think she
Yeah,
may
man.
have been the keynote speaker, but I think possibly the highlight for me was sitting down by the Harper River with a few guys, and one of them being your dad, Mr. Art, and it was a great time. And actually, he and I over since then have exchanged emails.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
he's he was pastor, obviously a pastor, and I'm a pastor, and to get to ask him pastoral questions and how
Yeah.
did you handle things over the years has been a treasure. So she may have been the keynote, but he was my highlight for me. So he's
That's
been a
pretty
real
cool.
treasure,
Did you guys smoke pipes down by the river? Or I bet he was.
Yeah.
We did,
Oh,
yes.
no. Well, we did. Yeah, we did indeed.
We won't tell
In
anybody though.
fact, yeah, we'll tell everybody. But yeah, part of the reason I was there was we have a mutual friend in Brian Rowley. Brian
Oh, yeah.
attends our church down here in Mobile, and actually the pipe out
I
was
love
me.
Brian.
So
He's good.
yeah, dear
Yeah.
friend.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're a treasure.
So Andrew, The God of the Garden, that's your latest book coming out, and like Brad said, we both enjoyed Adorning the Dark. I've taken a couple of groups of men at my church through that book, and just really was a fantastic read. Anybody who has any inkling to be a creative, or even if you're not, you can appreciate this book. And But man, I'm really looking forward to this one. It seems, I don't know, is it supposed to be a follow-up? Is it a continuation of that same conversation? Why gardens? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's still hard for me to figure out how to talk about it exactly, because in many ways it's similar. But yeah, when in early 2020, when I got kind of, all my touring for the year fell apart, obviously, and I was home, kind of like loving being home, because I really light up when I'm there, and have been aching to have some kind of a sabbatical for years and years, and to really have a reason to stay put. And so to be kind of forced into it was the only way it was ever going to happen, I think. And so I found myself, I think I was 3 weeks into the lockdown in March. I realized that I'd spent more nights consecutively in my own bed than in 20 years. And so
Wow.
that was my body was actually reacting, like I couldn't stop sleeping. And I think I'd just been moving so constantly for so long that being still was just this, like, ironically, a wake up call. I couldn't stop sleeping. So anyway, I not long after that, my editor at Broadman and Holman, who published Adorning the Dark, they were like, "Hey, I know you're grounded for the year. Do you want to write another book to kind of follow up Adorning the Dark?" And I said yes, very nervously, because I didn't yet know what the book was going to be about. And he's the one who suggested, "Hey, I know that a lot of people have really resonated with the chapter in Adorning the Dark about," I'm so sorry, I'm going to mute that, about people have resonated with the chapter about the building of the stone arch and the garden and all that kind of stuff. And he was right. It was interesting, of all of the chapters in that book that I get asked about, that's the one that people seem to resonate with the most. So I kind of like sank into that idea a little bit, like, okay, what is it that people are interested in? What if I were to start writing about place and paying attention to the created world, and like what God has to say to us about his creation, about himself through his creation. And so trees became the kind of the framework that I ended up using, because I love trees, and I've always loved trees, and have been fascinated by them since I was a little kid. And I was like, I realized that I'd been reading a lot of books about trees, and started digging in. And over the 15, I think, years that we've lived at the Warden, where we live, I've planted, I think, 48 trees of many different species, and really was like, what would happen if I started writing about trees that I remember? And so that's one angle of the story. The other angle was that I listened to the Bible Project podcast. I love those guys, and they have a 10-episode podcast series called Tree of Life. Did you guys listen to that? It's amazing. Like, digs into, like, yeah, the theme of trees in Scripture, and they point out that one of the things Tim says is that there is no better candidate for a scriptural theme than trees. Like, it starts in the garden with trees, ends with the tree in Revelation. The cross was in Acts called a tree. There's this tree motif that shows up again and again. And one of the cool things is that in Genesis, like in the creation account, there's this interesting correlation between, God making trees, and they bear fruit, and then God makes people and he says bear fruit. And so there's this thing that happens in Scripture where it's like, Psalm 1 starts with, like a tree planted by waters, so is a man who, I always get the verse mixed up, but the point is, trees, there's a lot to learn about the Lord from paying attention to trees and the way they grow and how they work. And so it started like that. And by the time I was finished with the book, I had written a whole bunch of memories of trees, and they all involved me encountering the presence of God in one way or another. And it gets pretty heavy. There's a fair bit about, a couple seasons of real depression, and just like looking up and realizing that Jesus also went to an olive grove to pray, the he was taken. And so there's a little bit of a corollary there. So it's just a memoir about trees, but mainly it's about the abiding presence of God.
when I read the bit, you quote from the Wonderful Life, and the guy yells out, "My grandfather planted that tree." It really resonated with me, like knowing history and being tied to place, like you talked about earlier. Perhaps maybe one of my favorite Petersons. No offense, Eugene Peterson, the pastor. In his book, The Pastor, talks about his home in Montana as his place. He says, place, not just any place, not just any location marked on a road or a map, but on a topo or a topographic map with named mountains and rivers, identified wildflowers and forest elevations above sea level and annual rainfall. I do all my work on this ground, Peterson says, and I don't levitate. I'm connected to this ground. Surely the Lord is in this place. And I didn't know it. And so he wanted to get to know that place. Why is place so, it was really evident in this book that place and what you're saying is so important. Why is place so important to you?
Well, I know for me, part of the reason it's important is because I grew up feeling very placeless. Because my dad was a pastor, we lived in the church parsonage in the house that I first lived in. It's a house that we didn't own. We moved when I was 7, ended up in another church parsonage for all of my, junior high and high school years. They didn't buy their place until after we left. And, of course, then I got married and bounced around from apartment to apartment. So I've always felt displaced. I've always felt like I was envious of people who were from a place and knew that they were from a place because their parents and their parents were from. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And you guys have these wonderful accents. Like, you sound like you're from a place, right? Are you both Alabama natives?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So born and bred. Yeah.
Beautiful. Right. And like, I'm a big Drew Holcomb fan. He sings that song about Tennessee. I was born here and raised here. I'll make my grave here. It's home, Tennessee. I've lived in Tennessee for 26 years now, and I still don't feel the kinship that he's talking about because I'm not from here. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't born here. I came here as a transplant. It's more home than I've ever known. But it's still like I'm deciding that it's my home. You know what I mean? It wasn't like it was given to me. And so I've always carried around this like weird little, kind of like a pebble in your shoe of homesickness. Like, I just feel it all the time. And so that's part of the reason I love the UK. I love going to Sweden. I've traveled my whole life. Everywhere I go, I'm like, is this it? Is this my true home? Is this the place where I'm going to really find that, that kinship that I've been looking for? And the truth is, no, like I'll never find it. I need to be. So a lot of the book is about learning to be content with what you've been given. There's this great poem by Jeannie Murray Walker. I need to memorize it because it's beautiful, but I think it's called, doesn't matter. It's about Adam. She's imagining Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. And Adam, you're in Adam's head, and he's a little annoyed by Eve. He doesn't really like what she called the name she chose for like the giraffe, whatever. He's just kind of like thinking about things he doesn't really like about her. And then a storm comes, and he sees her running towards him, and she's beautiful. And it says something like he begins the long work of learning to love what he's been given. And I was like, oh, what a beautiful picture of what a marriage is. What a beautiful picture of community. George MacDonald, I just read a quote a few minutes ago where he was like, you don't get to choose your neighbors. Like, your neighbor is whoever happens to be with you. And so I think that, like, when it comes to where I live, one of the most difficult sanctifying processes that I've been through is learning to just be still, just like look around at what you've been given, learn to love it. And I still have a hard time. Like, I don't like mosquitoes or ticks or July and August in Tennessee. I just have a hard time with it, but it's what I've been given. And so the book is me wrestling with that a little bit too. And I think, like, I remember Rich Mullins saying that you should learn the names of the trees on your street. And so I started doing that, years ago at the Warden. I wanted to learn the name. I wanted to be able to say what every tree was on our property. And it worked. It was amazing. Like, now when I look out the window, I mentioned this in the book, I don't just see a tangle of leaves. I see an ash tree and I see a hackberry and I see
That's right.
a white oak. And all of a sudden you're able to love it because it has a name.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about earlier. You had you called your the place where you live the Warren, and you planted all those trees. And you've got a beautiful garden. You know, we got to know James and Julie Whitmer through Hutchmood, and James has been on the podcast before and talking about his books that he's written. And you know, but you've got something special going on at the Warren, man. And so why the Warren, and why naming it that? And you know, giving a house a name is something that's foreign to some people.
Yeah, it's very common over here in the UK. Almost, it's one of the really fun things about walking through these villages over here is that every cottage has a name. Like, and the addresses are the name of the thing. Like I had to have Amazon ship something to the Airbnb that we're staying, and there's no house number. It's just called the Coach House.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so the guy has to just like come here and find the Coach House. It's the weirdest thing. And so I love that idea because it changes. Like I said, naming is a way of learning to love something, right? And so once we finally moved to a place that I was like, I think we need to decide that this is going to be the place we're going to have, we're going to pass it on to our children and maybe to their children, what the name should be. I was reading a book called Watership Down to rabbits that are on this quest to find a new home, and a rabbit, you know, a bunch of tunnels that rabbits have is called a rabbit warren, and so I named the house that, their property really that, and then I had another thought about the naming thing. Anyway, it's a way of learning to love, and I think that it was just like, oh, I remember what I was going to say. One of the cool things about once again, I show my like Anglophile card pretty hard in this new book, because I'm trying to get to the bottom of what is it about this place in the UK that really lights me up, and why don't I feel that same thing when I'm in the States? And the trick is, I used to think that it was prettier here. I don't think that anymore. Like, I really believe that there are places in Alabama and Tennessee that are just as beautiful as the British Isles. And you guys, I can see you nodding. You've been in places. If you guys are fishermen, you've been in places that are just brimming with the beauty of the Lord. I think part of the difference is there's so much history here that the hills have names, right? Like, when I look out my window in Nashville, there's this beautiful rise of hills kind of between us and this downtown Nashville. As far as I know, they're not named anything. Like I can't look at that and be like, oh, Jamie, did you notice that the Johnny Cash Hills were on fire with autumn this evening? Like, they're just not named anything. And I think it's because we're just kind of a younger country. Right. But there's something about it makes you feel like you're living in a storybook, right? As soon as you start naming things, like now there's a story that can attach itself to the place. And so in Cane Ridge, which is the part of Nashville that we live in, me and my neighbors have kind of like begun writing poetry about our little valley and our humble little creek that comes through the valley, that it's full of washing machines and people's trash. But we're trying to like reclaim, re-sanctify what God has given us, right? And to give it a story. And once it has a story, maybe the people who come after us will learn to love it a little bit better because we named it and kind of said, you know what, this is where the story of our lives is going to live out for a time.
Gosh, I love that, man.
Yeah, you said, I love something that you said, naming helps us to see, right? Why was it important for you throughout the book to not just name the trees but to also have these Latin names? What was the catalyst for that? You had, I was like, I loved that. I was like, man, we're getting deep into the names of these trees. In fact, earlier this year, I read, what was the name of that? The Hidden Life of Trees.
Oh yeah.
By the German Peter Wohlenben. I really enjoyed that book. And so it resonated with me. I was like, I want to know the names of these trees too. And so why was that important for you to have like these Latin names? Whose idea was that?
I think it was because in the very beginning of the project, I thought it was going to be a book that was very specifically about trees. And then the more I wrote, the more I realized that I think I sent a first draft to a few friends, and the consensus was, I don't think this book is as much about trees as you think it is. Because really it ends up, trees are, like I said, the framework, but it ends up being a book about kind of a memoir about some tough stuff in my life. Trees are just like always there, kind of in the background. But I think, again, it gets down to the specificity of the whole thing. Like it's not just a maple tree that I planted. It was a certain species of maple tree that I planted in the front yard. And it's an attempt to kind of drive home the fact that, like, these little things matter. Like, we're not talking in generalities. I wanted to drill down into the specifics, not just of the names of the trees, but like the street that I was on where this or that happened.
Right.
My wife and I just finished a book called A Severe Mercy, which is just gut-wrenching, beautiful book, about a guy who was friends with C.S. Lewis, and they're Americans, but the guy became a Christian here in Oxford, and the memoir is kind of about the love story between he and his wife and how Jesus broke through that. And it's so cool to me that while I'm reading this story, he was very specific about the streets that he walked and like the pubs that he went to with his wife, and so we can kind of retrace their steps and wow, this is fun. This where this or that happened. That's part of why, like, the Eagle and Child pub is so famous, is because this is where Lewis and Tolkien used to do this stuff. So again, it's the specificity gives it a story. So I'll probably be drilling down into that for the rest of my life. That works with songwriting too. Sorry, I'm just kind of rambling here, but one of the things I tell young songwriters, and I talk about this in Adorning the Dark, is that, like, you can talk about things in theoretical terms, and it'll kind of like just go past people. And my hunch is that's how sermons work too. As long as everything's kind of up here in the ether, and you're like exegeting a passage, it's like, cool, okay, I assent to what you're saying. But as soon as you ground it and you anchor it to a story, some specific pain or joy in your own life, and where it happened and how, man, the air in the room changes when you're telling that story. You can feel the audience begin to listen. Like, our hearts were wired for that. And so in your songwriting, as soon as I start feeling like I'm getting a little bit esoteric, I think, you know what, where was I when this happened? Oh, I was on this street. And then you put the street name in the song, or the person's name in the song, and all of a sudden the listener knows, oh, this isn't just theoretical. This is actually, you're not levitating, like you said, like Eugene said, you're actually touching the earth again. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I think, like, learning, for me pastorally, like learning my people's names, right?
Yeah.
Is so important to know and remember people's names, because I mean, that's what the rest of language is tied to, those names, right? Whether it's a person's name or a house's name. And it has meaning because it's attached to those. So it's grounded, right? Is what you're saying. So it's grounded in this place. We aren't levitating, but it's grounded. And so I'm thankful for that. And it makes me, growing up where I grew up was a small town called Monroeville, Alabama, which is the home of To Kill a Mockingbird. Mm. And but it was very much in the country, and the lumber industry, or the timber industry, was a big deal where I grew up. And so at our high school, you could take, instead of shop, you could take forestry class. And so another reason, it gave me flashbacks of having to memorize all those tree names, because that was part of what we did. So when we walk through the woods, you need to know which tree is which tree, and what does it produce, and what kind of wood would it make, and so forth and so on. So I love looking through trees, and my parents would always say, boy, if that tree could talk, it could tell some stories. And that was said all the time. Yeah. When we'd see some giant live oak tree, huge oak tree. And I live in Mobile now, which the streets are lined with these huge, the southern oak oaks that are, so they're just leaning over the roads, right? And they're gorgeous, covered in the moss. And, I always think that, boy, if those trees could talk, I bet they could tell some tales, because they're ancient. And so I love those names. You said earlier that it got heavy. It did get heavy. Like, there was almost a couple of times when it was almost suspenseful for me. I was like, what's he about to share with us? And so I don't want to, like, totally spoil it, for the readers. I do say, like, man, get it and read it, because I really enjoyed it. What was that like for you to man, to open yourself up the way that you did without giving away too much, because we obviously wouldn't want to give it all away. We want people to read the book, but you did open yourself up very personally.
Yeah, I've had a fair bit of practice with it as a songwriter, but it's way more explicit in a memoir. I was super
Mm-hmm.
nervous when Adorning the Dark came out because I'd never spoken as frankly about what goes on up in here and in here, and so I was pretty scared. And this to my shock, like as I began writing the book, the story kept wanting to go. As I was writing about trees, I was like, oh yeah, there's this other thing that happened, and it is a way. And do I write about that? I guess I do. I've got to take the plunge. And so the book isn't out yet as of this recording. I don't know when this is going to air, but I am, to be frank, quite terrified of the book coming out, because I feel like it was it's not like a tell-all, but it does go to some places that I didn't expect it to go. And my
Right.
deepest hope is that, like I said in the other book, the hope is that not that I will bleed all over the audience, but that it will help somebody feel less alone, or it'll ultimately
Yes.
draw more attention to the presence of Christ in those moments.
Yes.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Man, I really appreciate that angle, and the vulnerability that you're going to be sharing with everybody. I think the world needs more of that, rather than the constant facade that we all tend to put up over and over again. It seems like whenever I show vulnerability, someone else feels freer to reciprocate that. And
Yeah.
I think that's needed, especially in a world of toxic masculinity, having men be vulnerable and say, look, things aren't great, or
Yeah.
things were not great during that season. Being able to say, I'm not strong enough. That's why I need Christ. That's the whole point. So yeah, man, I think people will resonate with that. I'm really excited that when it gets out into the world, and this episode will air after its release, and so people will be able to get it. Yeah, that's going to be fantastic, man. I have a group of men awaiting its arrival so that we can go through another group study of it.
That's awesome.
Nice.
That's awesome.
You brought up, Andrew, you brought up, have you ever considered the fact that there were beekeepers in Galilee? Honey's mentioned. I didn't realize this, but I appreciated this. 61 times honey's mentioned in scripture. And then you talk about the apostles broiling fish and honey. And then I know you keep bees. What's a little bit of a side story from Adorning the Dark? What are some things that observations from keeping bees and then if somebody wanted to start keeping bees, give us a little a glimpse into that really quickly.
Oh man, well, you're throwing me into the briar patch. One thing I've learned about beekeepers is that once they start talking about it, they don't stop talking about it.
They love talking about it.
Oh yeah. Man,
you're talking to a couple of fly fishermen, and so we're very similar in that. So
you know the deal. Yeah. Like I attracts a certain kind of person. People, how those things work. So I'm always like just beyond your attention span. So no, it is endlessly interesting to me. I'm kind of a lazy beekeeper, is what they call us. So there are guys that I know that are really nerdy about it. They, every week, sometimes more often, they'll put on their suit and get in there and mess with it. And I think that's what you would need to do in order to maximize honey production. Like there's a lot of tricks, you can do. I'm not trying to sell the honey. I think last year I got 50 pounds, which is like 1 5-gallon bucket of honey. And that's a lot of honey. It ends up being just enough for us to eat as much as we want and to give a bunch away to friends and family, and then about the time we run out, it's the next summer and we need to harvest some more. So the funny thing is the weather didn't cooperate and I wasn't able to harvest this year. So I have 2 hives right now and they were doing great. and we had to leave to come here before I got to it. And so
Yeah.
that's the nice thing about being a lazy beekeeper, is that they know what they're doing, and I'm just going to trust that it's going to work out. So that's one thing I would say. But I'll tell you I may have told you, or you may have heard this story before, but the moment that I knew that I loved beekeeping there's been a few, but one of the big ones was when I first harvested my first batch of honey. And my bee mentor, you kind of got to have a guy who's been doing it for years to kind of show you. Yeah. YouTube will only get you so far, Yeah. I think fishing's the same way, I'm sure. Like you can kind of learn how to do it, but like until like somebody's actually touching something and you're feeling it and you're in the world, you need some help. And so I was over at his house. He had all the equipment. I had gotten my frames, and he was showing me how to, cut the cap off the honey, and we're spinning it, and he was like, taste it. And I was like, can I really taste it? And he was like, yeah. So for a year, I'd been waiting for this moment to like actually like taste this honey that had been gathered in my front yard. And there was honeycomb, so I took the comb, and you actually put the whole comb in your mouth, and you like suck the honey out of it. Chunk of beeswax that it's bouncing with this sweetness. He quoted the psalm that says, your law, O Lord, is like honey from the comb. And at which point you realize that King David knows what this tastes like. Like this very experience is something that is ancient and for thousands of years, So that's good. Jesus, I'm sure, knows what it's like to pop the honeycomb in his mouth and suck the honeycomb. And further than that, like the law of the Lord, the will of God was in the psalmist's mind when he correlated those two things. I don't usually think of the law of the Lord as a sweet thing. It's more of a burden. But it kind of changed the way I thought about it. I was like, oh man, to think sweet of God's law. So I just loved the fact that in that moment I felt connected to King David in a way that I'd never felt connected to him before. So I was like, all right, I'm in.
I love it.
Oh, my father-in-law, he's quite the beekeeper. He has 30 hives. And so, I mean, it's just, he's in it all the time. He's retired, and he had to retire so that he can
not a lazy beekeeper.
No, he definitely is in it every day. And I just found out, Andrew, I work at Stanford University, and I just found out there are beekeepers on campus, and they have local honey from the health sciences. And so I just bought two jars of that. And so I'm fascinated with that whole process. We eat it on about everything.
That is so cool. You guys are destined for it. I can tell. You're going to be beekeepers before this is over.
Yeah. Just so you know, I've got in my Amazon wish list like the starter kit. So, and that was before I read this book or had this conversation. So
that's great.
Normally one of the things we ask Andrew is for us. So we open up this podcast and we say it's a podcast somewhere vaguely between Lewis and Tolkien and Lewis and Clark. We just like stories and adventure, right? And we want to find clarity in the stories we tell and the adventures that shape us. And that's what these conversations are about. So obviously we always close this conversation with what's your next adventure? But rather than that, I want to hear maybe a brief story about your recent adventure, your trek. It seemed like incredible on the wall, right? So a little bit about that, and how do I pronounce that name correctly? And what, because so tell us a little bit about that. It looked awesome.
Yeah, man. It's Hadrian. Hadrian was like a Roman emperor in the early, like in 180 or something like that, I forget, but almost 2,000 years ago. It's funny, like if you're not from the UK, it's hard to get your head around the fact that like the Romans were here 2,000 years ago. So like, in Jesus's day, the Romans would have known about England, and London was beginning to be founded at that point, and so there's all these Roman walls and ruins here, and on top of that is the
Roman baths. I know I've visited the Roman baths before.
Totally. Yeah. There's all this cool stuff, but just the layers of history here are just too much for the brain to even get a hold of. But one of the things I love about Britain is this whole footpath culture that they have here. Like, that's one of the reasons I think that we don't think of Alabama and Tennessee as beautiful, is because we can't walk across it. Because in the States, you'd get shot by the local farmer or landowner. They wouldn't abide. Just
farmer maggots. The farmer maggots
Totally.
are all over the place.
Totally. Yeah. And it kills me because I'm like, oh man, we only ever get to see Tennessee from the highway, or a state park. But here it's like you can walk through. Literally today, Jamie and I walked through a field of alpacas. Because it was like, that's where the footpath went, and we just walked through. And so
Nice.
you just cross people, and the farmer will be out there and he's like, how's it going? Good, how are you? And you just cross his field. And so I love that idea. And there are lots of these like long, you can like pick a footpath and long walks that you can do here. But Hadrian's Wall was a almost 2,000 year old wall that divided what is now Scotland and England in the south. So it was like the barbarians all lived up north, and they built this wall to kind of protect the Roman territory. And it's, all these years later, there are big chunks of the wall that are still there. And you can walk. We walked 70 miles, I guess. And let me tell you, I am no backpacker. I don't know how people carry
It's a long
everything.
way.
Yeah. So my buddy Mark and I did the most like genteel version of this, where you actually pay somebody to bring your suitcase to the B&B. And so we would wake up and just, have breakfast at the pub, and then strike out, walk 13 miles, get there in the afternoon. There's our bag waiting for us at the next inn, and we'd shower and eat at the pub. And
Hey, that's my kind of hiking right there.
Dude,
I think I can get on board with that.
It was great. It was great. Like to have a pub at every stop, and to have, your bag carried. So you just literally have your backpack with your journal in it or whatever. But it was incredible to like basically cross the island of Britain. Like we ended at the sea. And yeah, it was amazing. So I've got the bug. I got to figure out, how do we bring that to the States, man? How do we convince the farmer?
I love that tangent.
Yeah.
I love that whole rant. And I was feeling that, because there are beautiful places in this state that, recently, Brian and I got to go, and we floated down the Tallapoosa River, which is over in central East Alabama, and it goes by Horseshoe Bend, where the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. There's a national park there. I didn't even know there was a national military park there.
Wow.
But where the Battle of Horseshoe Bend happened, and it's just tucked away, and I didn't even know it was there. And it was gorgeous, a gorgeous, gorgeous river, just overhung by all these sycamores and these huge trees, just walling it up all the way down. And we had the most fun, but I didn't even know it was there, and it was beautiful.
That's so cool. That just reminded me, me and the guys, this is probably 10 years ago, the band, and we will sometimes pick up a hitchhiker when we're traveling. And we picked up a guy in southern Tennessee, and, it's always interesting to hear their story. And we were driving him toward Birmingham, and he wanted out of the car right when we crossed into Alabama. And there wasn't anything there really. He was just like, yep, this is where I want off. And I was like, what's here? And he was like, oh man, just south of the border, right through the woods over there, there's the most beautiful glade of trees, and there's a waterfall and a lake, and that's where I'm headed. And I was like, okay, awesome. Good luck, bro. And he hopped out of the car and traipsed off, hopped the fence and walked into the woods, basically. And I was like, there's this whole world that we don't get to see, And so, yeah, I love that story, that at every interstate, there's probably a whole universe of beauty that we don't even get to notice. So that's maybe we need to figure out a way to start the legislation to get the right to roam in the States. That will never happen.
Yeah, I know I will say this though, Andrew, one of the things I got into is road cycling and triathlon, and there are areas where they call them rails to trails programs, where they take old rail lines and they're paved for bike trail. And there's some really great ones all around.
Katy Trail.
So no, where's that?
Katy Trail goes from Kansas City to St. Louis, straight across Missouri.
That's awesome.
500 miles or 400 miles or something like that. And it's all on one of those rails to trails things. And now, because people have been doing it along the way, all these little towns now have little cafes, places have sprung up to help the traveler. And you end,
Yeah.
I think, St. Charles, which is where Lewis and Clark set out.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Cool. Yeah. Brian and I have ridden. There's one in North Alabama that goes from North Alabama all the way. I think it goes all the way to Atlanta because it connects to the Silver Comet Trail there.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So there are some, if you just know where to look, but there's obviously not as common. And you're right. Like to see that happen would be pretty rare.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
New creation.
Well, Andrew,
he's making all things new.
Yeah.
Your touring season is about to crank up with Behold the Lamb of God. Not too far from whenever this podcast will air. Will be probably mid to late October. So it'd be coming around the corner. I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to see you in Birmingham, Alabama.
Awesome.
You've got a few stops in England, so not to be confused.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I can't wait. I hated not getting to. I hated/loved not getting to do the tour last year. It was the first time I've ever been home for Christmas. For the season of Christmas, just magical to be able to be with my wife. Since my children were born, I've done the tour. And so they've never known a December where Pops was around, to kind of go do stuff with, so it was really sweet last year, but also, man, I miss singing the gospel. When I finally started doing shows again, I realized how much I am edified by getting to tell other people about Jesus,
Yes.
Not getting to do it in the way that I normally do, I was like, oh man, I forgot how much I need this for my own spiritual life, is to get to be the one telling about it, So I'm excited about it. It's going to be fun.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah, I have this one thing I wanted to bring up on my desk here at the office. You mentioned in the book, there was the documentary Live Godspeed, right? You talked about that.
Oh yeah.
And so years ago, a really good friend of mine, Travis Buchanan, he was there at Horseshoe, or when they did the release of that video.
Yep.
And he came back, and he's a good close friend of mine. And you'd really like Travis a lot. He did his PhD work there in St. Andrews, and it was all about Lewis and Tolkien. Anyway, he's a scholar, man. But he turned me on to the Godspeed video years ago, and I watched it. It was very impactful. But there's this little note I keep on my desk, and I just kind of bring this full circle. It was from Eugene Peterson's one of his interviews on there, and says, "There is no place on earth without the potential for unearthing holiness," he says, right where we are with these people that we are with. And so, I'm thankful for your book. I'm excited for people to get a hold of it, to maybe encourage them to look around, like you said, that this state that we live in is beautiful. Tennessee is beautiful. It's not, no place is more beautiful than the other. In fact, every place has the possibility, right, for unearthing holiness and for God to use. So I'm thankful thank you for opening yourself up the way you did. I know that's scary, but I'm here to tell you it was very encouraging for me, and I know it will be for others. And the Lord, I believe, will use the God of the Garden to resonate with more, because not everybody is going to write a song or write a book, but this one seems like it's going to spread much wider and tie everybody's story. It made me start to look around at trees again to go, man, how are my stories tied to trees, right? And how did the Lord use those throughout my own life? So, man, I think it's a great job. Thank you for taking time to do that. And
that's so encouraging. Thank you.
I know that Paul probably wouldn't have written his letters had he not been in prison, and you probably wouldn't have written this book had 2020 and the pandemic not hit, right?
Yeah.
So you slowed down.
Yeah.
You slowed down long enough to write a beautiful book. And man, we're grateful for your time today and for that book. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, man.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, like we always say, and I hope your book does the same. We hope these conversations encourage people. We hope it challenges people to write their own stories, tell their own stories, and share their own adventures in the storied outdoors.